now.
Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, sponsored by Logos Bible Software, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. And today, we are on a season 5 apologetics season episode, and we are doing abortion. We are on the topic of abortion. And on this season, we have experts in their field of study come on and talk about these topics. So today we have from the Charlotte Lozier Institute 3 doctors on: Dr. Ingrid Skop, Dr. Tara Sander Lee, and Dr. David Prentice on. We're going to introduce them a little further here in a moment, but as always, some just quick show note reminders for you guys. There's a link to the Charlotte Lozier Institute, so you guys can check out some of their articles, some really good research articles that both Peter and I read prior to this interview. So you can take a look at those. We'll put those on the show notes. Also, some information how to contact Peter, myself. We're really active on social media, Instagram, Twitter, at Guilt Grace Pod is the handles for both those. You can email us, guiltgracepod@gmail.com. You can find us on YouTube. These conversations are automatically put on YouTube with the video. Guilt, Grace, Gratitude Podcast. Just type that in the search bar, hit subscribe, keep up with our videos. Again, all our videos are going to be categorized. So this episode is going to be under the categorization of Season 5 Apologetics, for example. And then there's going to be a link to find the closest Reformed church near your area or confessional churches. So you just hit that link, type in your zip code, the closest churches in your area will come up. And then also you heard me mention Logos Bible Software. They're our main sponsor, and you're going to hear halfway through this episode some words from some of our other sponsors as well as Logos. And also, if you are interested in helping us out in helping keep growing our podcast, we're 2 years old now. We're growing pretty rapidly, and with that comes extra needs and equipment and bandwidth and microphones and websites and all that fun stuff. So if you are able to fund us in any way, we would really appreciate it. If not, that's okay. This show is free for around the world, but there is different levels and ways to give to us. So take a look at that Patreon link in our show notes. So if I didn't forget anything else, I'll let Peter further introduce our 3 doctors from the Charlotte Lozier Institute.
Yeah, we have, as Nick said, Dr. Tara Sander Lee. So I'll go through each of their bios real quick, and then we'll have themselves introduce themselves a little bit more further. But Dr. Tara Sander Lee is a Harvard-trained scientist with extensive research experience of abortion, on the topic of abortion, including the science of being knit together in a mother's womb and explaining the high rate of false positives in common prenatal screenings, such as Down syndrome, which often lead to abortion. Also have Dr. Ingrid Skop as an OBGYN with more than 25 years experience, gives regular interviews to debunk the rampant misinformation that has sprouted in the wake of Dobbs, such as false claims that state pro-life laws prohibit treatment for miscarriage and ectopic pregnancy. And lastly, Dr. David Prentice, his PhD as well, was one of the first credentialed scientists to publicly take a pro-life stand. He would regularly speak at conferences presenting science from a pro-life perspective, and then have a few people come up afterward to whisper, "I agree with you, but I'm afraid to speak up." So we have all these 3 scientists. So if you want to introduce yourself in the kind of the order that I presented, tell the audience a little bit about yourself, what you do, and how you got into this.
Absolutely. So my name is Tara Sander Lee. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm a scientist. For over 20 years, I worked in academia and clinical science, received a PhD in biochemistry, postdoctoral training at Harvard, and then was the director of a research lab and a clinical lab doing molecular diagnostic testing in children. The Holy Spirit really convicted me to start to speak up for the unborn while I was directing my labs, and I started to get involved by just doing testimonies, scientific testimonies in my state. That's when I became aware of the Charlotte Lozier Institute, and I have been just blessed to be able to work as the Senior Fellow and Director of Life Sciences with the Charlotte Lozier Institute for about 3 years now. So I do scientific research, legislative testimony, presentations, writings, anything that helps to educate policymakers and the public on the value and undeniable humanity of every human life from the moment of conception until birth. So
Awesome.
thank you.
Love it. Yeah.
And I'm Dr. Ingrid Skopp. I have been blessed to be an obstetrician gynecologist for 25 years. I think I've delivered probably over 5,000 babies.
I saw that number. I was like, holy smokes.
I love what I do. I love delivering babies. And I am an advocate for both of my patients. And so I have been increasingly vocal about just what I see as gaslighting and misinformation. The American public, I think, do not really understand the issue of abortion. And so I'm extremely grateful to be with you guys today, and also to be affiliated with the Charlotte Lozier Institute, because I think that we're one of the premier organizations that's putting out very accurate, very well referenced and resourced medical information so that those who desire to know the truth can find out the truth. And just grateful to be here and looking forward to this conversation.
Awesome. Yeah.
I'm David Prentice. I'm an old geek. I've got about 45 years experience in this.
Hey, we're young
area.
geeks. You're an old geek. That works out.
That's right. Got my degrees at University of Kansas, biochemistry, cell biology, did some time at Los Alamos National Lab doing science, taught at UT Med School for a few years, and then spent about 20 years teaching and doing research at Indiana State University, in association also with IU Med School. And then I started getting these questions. Can you explain stem cells? Can you explain cloning? And I had a friend who got elected to Congress, and he said, nobody up here speaks science. Could you come translate? So got involved in sort of the policy aspects from there. Actually spent about 10 years working at Family Research Council, again, explaining science. And then about 8 years ago, went over to the Charlotte Lozier Institute, still doing the same thing, especially some of the weirder science, is what my colleagues say, 3-parent embryos and gene-edited babies and human-animal chimeras and other sorts of things, but also any of the life issues. And Charlotte Lozier Institute was founded in 2011 for just this purpose, to try and explain the science and statistics related to life.
Yeah.
We think of ourselves not as a think tank, but as an action tank, where we've got all of these elite scholars, at this point over 70 associate scholars. They've got a day job, but they don't mind my calling up and say, hey, Dr. Sandra Lee, could you go to Mississippi and testify on this bill? Hey, Dr. Scott, could you write this article? Or could you media with these guys on guilt, grace, and gratitude? So
do you guys are like the Avengers? So you just send off whoever you need.
Somewhat like that.
You're like you're like Iron Man.
A key group of Avengers. So, but again, focused on the deep research and facts about life, and then being able to translate that and explain it so that people get the real facts.
That's great. And it's exactly what we're looking for. It's we want to talk about it in general, but also like give Christians not just the apologetic argument, like, hey, this is how to whack somebody else with it, but actually, no, this is the deep scientific level of what we're talking about. And then let's translate that into talking to your friends and family, whoever it may be.
Yeah. Quick fun fact about me. As we're recording this right now, my wife is 8 months pregnant. Yeah. Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And it'll be our second child. And when this is published and people are listening to it, when is this, in February or so? He'll be
publishes in March. Yeah.
March. Yeah. So he's going to be, our next child's going to be born in October. So yeah. Just fun fact there, based on the content of this. So, yeah, I think this is going to be kind of a graphic question for you guys. But I think it's really important is to start off this with a really kind of to address the elephant in the room, the really heavy issue here. To and this might be a little bit of a graphic question. So if some parents are with kids, just let them know, letting you guys know. It's a little forewarning. But what is an abortion and what happens in the womb and to a baby and what happens to the mother during a when a abortion is performed?
So an abortion is defined as causing the intentional death of the unborn living human being in the uterus. We typically call it an induced abortion, so it's an intentional action, as compared to a spontaneous abortion, which is a miscarriage, which is a fetus or an embryo that dies through no one's fault, just through external causes. There's several different ways to do abortions. In the first trimester, about 40% of all abortions are performed surgically, which is a D&C procedure, very similar to what a woman might have if she has a miscarriage. In the second trimester, this becomes a little bit more of a brutal procedure. It's called a dilation and evacuation. The layman's term is a dismemberment abortion. So I think that says essentially what happens. This is from about 13, 14 weeks on, at the time that we know that an unborn human being has the ability to feel pain. Increasingly promoted over recent years is what's called a medical or a chemical abortion.
Yeah.
This is provided with two medications. Mifepristone blocks the progesterone, the hormonal support, and about 24 hours later, misoprostol is given that induces contractions. So it kills the baby and then essentially induces labor to pass. This is the reasons for promoting it have to do with this is convenient for the abortion industry. It very little cost is involved. They're not required. They don't have to hire a surgeon, but it's not good for women. It's a very traumatic process for them. And it has about 4 times the complications that a surgical abortion has. And that's additionally, in our country, about 1% of abortions are performed after a baby is far enough along in the second half of the pregnancy to be able to live outside of his mother. And the majority of those are performed for elective reasons too. Some of them that are extremely advanced are induced, just as we induce labor at term. If the baby is not killed in advance with an injection of a poison in his heart, we know that babies are born alive in that situation.
Okay. And what gets even less airtime is the trauma that mothers go through physically and mentally, emotionally after an abortion. Are there any common post-abortion effects that linger with the mother?
I think there's several things to consider. The first is that hormonally, a woman is primed to bond with her unborn child. So a woman does not reject the child, no matter the cry. I mean, and most women who choose abortions are in crisis, but the solution to the crisis, rejecting their unborn child, always harms them emotionally. Additionally, there can be short-term physical complications. We mentioned the increasing frequency of medical abortions. About 1 out of 5 women will have a complication. About 3 to 8% will not be able to pass all the tissue and will require surgery, sometimes in emergent conditions. Of the first trimester surgical abortions, about 1% will have an immediate complication, and later surgical abortions, probably 10 to 13% will have a complication. A medical abortion that's performed later, such as the induction abortions that we talked about, up to 50% of the time the woman needs surgery to remove all of the pregnancy tissue. There are long-term complications. Surgical damage to the uterus can cause an abnormal placental attachment in a subsequent pregnancy, which can be related to catastrophic bleeding at delivery, what's called a placenta accreta spectrum disorder. the risk of preterm labor in a subsequent pregnancy is increased after damage from a surgical abortion. There's some evidence to suggest that even the risk of breast cancer later in life may increase after abortion because a woman does not carry a pregnancy to term, which we know has a protective effect. And I think we all intuitively are aware that some women suffer mental health complications from their abortion. We know that there's women who are at higher risk for that, those who have multiple abortions, teenagers, those who may desire their pregnancy. It's often assumed that every woman who aborts has an unintended pregnancy, but that is not the case. Some women desire their pregnancy, but their circumstances or coercion from other people in their lives cause them to obtain an abortion. And we know that those women are at much higher risk to suffer. They can suffer through anxiety, depression, substance or alcohol use or abuse, and self-harm and suicide. A study in Finland with very accurate data tells us that a woman is 6 times as likely to commit suicide in the year after an abortion than if she had carried her pregnancy to term.
Yeah, it just doesn't get near the airtime you think it should get after. It sometimes it seems like, well, it's easy as like getting an abortion, your kid's gone, and now you kind of live this free life without this and making your own choices, but it doesn't seem that easy.
Yeah, the assumption that we've reversed the clock, we can never reverse the clock. And unfortunately, the majority of the studies that are published in the United States are published by researchers affiliated with the abortion industry. And clearly, they have a motivation to downplay these concerns. And viewers should be aware that we don't keep any mandatory data in our country. So every complication you hear about has been voluntarily reported. So we know that deaths and complications, even the numbers of how many abortions occur, those are all voluntarily collected data and highly inaccurate.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it sounds to me not unlike, because I come from the fitness industry, and a lot of research done in the fitness industry has been, I mean, it's been more widely produced now, but was funded by the sugar industry, and so they had a big stake in the interest of trying to keep a lot of their stuff kind of in front, which sounds not too dissimilar from what you're describing about the abortion industry too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, this is good background, laying the stage of all this. So this is a big question people have, obviously, about when the life begins in the baby. So do we have any evidence? What evidence do we have for the earliest stage of life for a baby in the womb, and how would we define life?
So it's so exciting, and I'm excited to tell you that centuries of scientific discovery have provided proof that from the moment of conception, there is the creation of a new, totally distinct human being, a life that is alive. And this is a human organism, a human being that is biologically distinct from every other human being on the planet. That is how God designed it. Even twins, we see that there are subtle differences. And so we know scientifically that this is the case, because at the point of fertilization, when the sperm fuses with the egg, that results in the creation of this new, totally distinct organism. And these key steps are initiated that begin the development of this new human organism. I mean, each cell contains all of the information and fundamental molecules that individual, he or she, needs to grow, mature, and function from the very beginning and for the rest of his or her life. And so we know this, there's been a lot of biochemical, cellular studies that have done, but I think it's also important that people understand that there are these what's called the Carnegie stages of human development that were first established in 1942 and have since been expanded, but they remain the standard used by all biologists to describe the first 8 weeks of pregnancy and the first weeks of human life. And guess what describes the very first step of human life? Well, it's Carnegie stage 1A, which marks the moment of fertilization when the sperm fuses with the egg. And I think it's also important to note that biologists agree that life begins at fertilization. This isn't just, some idea that we've made up.
Yeah.
So
Gave up
we
like
know that this
50
is
years ago after the first Roe v. Wade. Like, oh my gosh, this is a thing that we just discovered.
right. I mean, there's textbooks that are written on this. Biologists agree, and I think it's really important that people understand that a survey was actually done by the University of Chicago. A study was done just about a year ago. It was published, and so what they found in this research is that that they quantified the number of biologists that confirm life begins at fertilization. And what they found from this study of surveying over 5,000 biologists, that 96% affirmed that human life begins at fertilization. And this was of all different people of all different walks of life, right? So just to give you a snapshot, I mean, 92% of them were Democrat, right? 63% were non-religious. So I think it's really important that people understand that the biologists agree that human life begins at conception because it's a scientific fact and is based on objective scientific evidence. I talked about the molecules that are available, right from the moment of conception. DNA is one of these most fundamental molecules that's in all living things, and it's passed on from generation to generation. And I think it's really important that God designed each person to be unique, and that DNA is unique, and that DNA is in part what's needed for that cell to grow and to continue to develop. And I just want to point out that we have the Charlotte Lozier Institute has a great resource called A Scientific View of When Life Begins. And this was written by Dr. Maureen Conduct, one of our scholars. And she makes an important point that the cells, the tissues, and the organs that are produced during development do not somehow generate the embryo, right? They are actually produced by the embryo as it directs its own development to more mature stages of human life. So this is an organized, coordinated behavior of the embryo, and it's a defining characteristic of any human organism, of human life. And so we know scientifically that this is the case, that life begins at conception. But I also just want to point out, from a Christian perspective, the Holy Spirit revealed this to King David when he wrote Psalm 139, right? He wrote that we are fearfully and wonderfully made inside our mother's womb. And what's just amazing that, he claimed, he wrote how our frame was not hidden from God when made in that secret place and knit together in our mother's womb. And so then centuries after that Psalm was written, the scientists Watson and Crick actually proposed the structure of DNA, which, as I mentioned earlier, is like the blueprint of life, right? And in their seminal Nature paper from 1953, they described DNA as two ribbons of DNA that are genetic material that are woven together. So in the same way that the Psalm talked about how we are knit together, woven together in our mother's womb, DNA is actually like two ribbons that are woven together. And so I just think it's fascinating how just this Holy Spirit revealed the truth of, in science and the evidence that we see today.
Yeah, and even before Nick's next question, you kind of described it already, but before his question, like a quick little comment to it, it seemed like maybe this is our own perspective, but 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it did seem like the debate was on conception. Like, when is a baby actually a baby? And now it doesn't seem like that's the question anymore. It's like, well, yeah, it's a baby, but we're still going to terminate its life. I don't know, like, what happened within the last 15 years for that switch or that transition to occur from like, yeah, we debated it, but now it's a fact, but we don't care.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. I mean, I think you will definitely have some people that really aren't aware of the science, that this truly is a living human being, right? That it's not just a clump of cells, but you're right. There's going to be other people that they know the science. I mean, these are going to be physicians that they absolutely know the fact that this is a baby, but they're blinded by the just how wrong the act is by intentionally killing that unborn innocent life.
Yeah.
This is maybe you could help us walk through the gestation cycle of a baby's development from the conception to birth over those 9 months.
To be honest,
yeah, absolutely.
I don't know this. Yeah, I think most guys are like, yeah, please tell me, because I have no idea.
So what I will say, just because of time constraints, we have developed an amazing website called thevoyageoflife.com, which walks the person through every single stage of development from the very beginning, like I talked about conception, all the way up until birth. And this is an amazing resource because we know that sometimes it's hard to get access to all the science and it can be confusing. So I'm gonna direct people to go to get all the facts, but I will tell you very quickly, just because of time, that as we mentioned, you know, the life begins at conception. At that point, when the sperm fuses with the egg, that early embryo is, or that human being is called a zygote. It is a single-celled human capable of becoming a 30 trillion cell adult. It's amazing. And so then that zygote is going to quickly divide into 2 cells, then 4 cells. They're going to continue to divide. And then what we're going to have is that we're going to have what's called a blastocyst. So these are just terms used to describe the very young human being, right? No different than we would like describe a toddler or, you know, a teenager, right? These are just the names that are given to describe the earliest human being inside the womb. And so once that early embryo has become a blastocyst, it's about 200 cells. And so that's at that stage, that embryo then is going to implant inside into the mother's womb. And so then that embryo can begin to obtain nourishment from the mother. And so it's just after implantation takes place, we see just remarkable development occur. So just within 21 to 22 days after conception, we already see the heart begin to beat. And the heart is going to be the first organ that is developed. And so there's different ways to, and Dr. Scott can maybe talk about this in a little more detail if there's question, but there's 2 different ways to determine the age of a baby. So there's post-conception, from the moment of conception, and then gestation. So, but the heart begins to beat just 21 to 22 days after conception. That's in the 6th week of gestation. And so this is in the embryonic period, which is the first 8 weeks of post-conception. And just within that first 8 weeks, we know that by the end of that 8th week, he or she already has 4,000 body structures, including fingers and toes, eyes, nose, lips. It's incredible that that baby absolutely, you know, has all the features and body parts mostly in place by just that end of that embryonic period. And then at the beginning of the 9th week, then that's the beginning of the fetal period, and that will be fetal. The fetal will be considered a fetus then up until the point of birth. And we just there are so many amazing things that happen during the fetal period. We know that by 13 weeks post-conception, that's 15 weeks gestation, that the baby can already respond to touch, feel pain, taste, has a fully formed, it can actually suck his or her thumb. I mean, we already know that the baby has a preference for whether he or she is going to be left or right-handed. We know that fingerprints are fully developed by 17 weeks. By 22 weeks, she can already respond to music. And you can hear her mother reading, singing. And so it's just, I think it's important to realize that there's so much that happens just within, you know, the very first 8 weeks, but then the baby just continues to just grow and develop more and more just and during that fetal development. And I think it's important to understand just how much more we know because of the unborn child, because in part of ultrasound. I think a lot of people don't understand that, you know, just, you know, decades ago, we barely could see inside the womb. But now, because of ultrasound advancements, we can now see all of these things that the baby is doing inside the womb. And not only that, but we have ability to treat some of these babies inside the womb. So if some of these babies that are diagnosed with birth defects, such as like spina bifida, they can actually go in and treat that baby inside the womb with fetal surgery and repair the defect. And so these babies are treated just like any other patient outside the womb. They're given anesthesia to control the pain so that they're not suffering. And it's remarkable how much is happening inside the womb. And so I encourage you to go to Voyage of Life to read voyageoflife.com to just learn more.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the Lozier Institute, as we're talking about, came out with an article on June 27th of this year, post Dobbs. It's fact-checked. Dobbs will not impact life-saving medical care for high-risk or ectopic pregnancies. And I think there's been some misconception around ectopic pregnancies and we call it regular pregnancies. So what are some high-risk or ectopic pregnancies, and how do they differ from abortion?
Yeah, it's very unfortunate because I think in the post-Dobbs time period, the media, which are overwhelmingly pro-choice, um, I don't know if they did this intentionally or if everybody just kind of happened to do this all at the same time, but they began spreading misinformation about what there are 26 states that have pro-life or laws that aim to protect fetal life.
Yeah.
And not all of them have gone into effect yet, but every single one we have reviewed, every single one has an exception for the life of the mother. So in the rare event that a woman's pregnancy posed such a serious risk to her life, every single one allows intervention. But what we've seen is some doctors are confused and don't think they can treat miscarriages. Well, clearly that's not a life. That's a fetus that has passed away. An ectopic pregnancy is about 2% of pregnancies are implanted in a location other than the uterus. And that's just very dangerous for the mother. It does not have the ability to go to a live birth. So we know that baby is inevitably going to miscarry. But as the pregnancy progresses, and typically these are in the fallopian tube, as the tube grows, the tube can rupture. It doesn't have the ability to contract those blood vessels and stop the bleeding. And so many women have died from ruptured ectopic pregnancies. And yet I'm in Texas. I'm hearing rumors that there are doctors who don't know if they can treat an ectopic pregnancy.
Yeah.
Well, if that's not a life of the mother exception, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
Additionally, the good news is when these life-threatening events happen, they almost always, with the exception of an ectopic, occur later in the pregnancy, in the second half of the pregnancy. With the amazing technology in our neonatal intensive care units, we can save babies as young as 22 weeks out of 40 weeks. So just a little tiny bit over halfway through the pregnancy. Most of the time when those events occur, maybe it's life-threatening hypertension, high blood pressure, maybe it's some sort of a cardiac defect that the woman has that is suddenly her body's decompensating. Occasionally, the water bag will break extremely early. And this is a situation that can put a woman at risk for a severe infection, sepsis, and women have died from that. Anytime those situations occur, it is appropriate to separate the mother and the baby. But that does not have to be an intentional abortion, which, as we discussed earlier, is intentionally ending the life of the fetus.
Yeah.
Many times in my career, I have never performed a direct abortion. Like I said, at 5,000 babies, there have been situations where I have needed to deliver a woman. I can do that in a standard way. I can do that by induction, occasionally by C-section, but I don't have to directly go in. This would be the D&E dismemberment abortion at this gestational age. I don't have to go in and destroy that child in order to separate him from his mother. Even in the heartbreaking situation where he is too young or too sick to live, I can give her her baby to hold and to mourn and to bury. That is a much more caring way to deal with these situations than to say, I'm sorry, ma'am, you need an abortion of this child that most of the time you strongly desire. So what we see, I think, is that the abortion industry, in order to protect this procedure that almost all the time, 97+% of the time, is performed for social, financial, or other reasons, but they're using the very, very rare situations to try to keep it legal in every situation. They're trying to turn the American people against pro-life laws by insinuating that it's going to harm women. But the reality is, I think we're going to see that women's lives are going to be better when they have access to other resources other than just ending the life of their child.
Yeah, it's to add an exclamation point to that. It's we're generally speaking, we're tending, which is good. We're tending towards like a pro woman, but unless it's abortion, it's not really pro woman. It's like we're going against women in this aspect and not seeing their emotional, physical life and how some of this stuff affects them. Because I think I was talking to my wife before this too, that there's even just around ectopic pregnancy, she's like, well, you should talk to them about ectopic pregnancies. And I looked up some research on that stuff and just how like muddled some of this stuff's become. And there's an assumption that this is the same thing as this. And if we don't do this, then we're not saving the woman's life. And There's been so much misinformation about this that we felt the need to distinguish this, even though we know it occurs less often. We know it occurs, so we want to make sure that we hit some of this stuff and talk about it as well.
Yeah, sadly, most medical organizations are pro-choice, and they have been silent. So, I'm in Texas. We're one of the first ones to pass a law.
Yep.
Even today, almost a year after we passed our heartbeat bill, the Texas Medical Board has said nothing. The American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, other than whining about the loss of reproductive rights, has said very little to help doctors know in what situations they can intervene. And the doctors are afraid. They're afraid that if they make the wrong decision, that they will be charged with a felony and that no one will support them. And this is so unfortunate. And I would just end by saying a woman and her child are not natural enemies.
No.
So we've pitted them against each other, unfortunately, and to the detriment of both of them.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this leads actually into this question pretty well. Common argument for abortion, the people that support pro-choice and abortion would be the cases of rape and incest, known disability in the fetus, jeopardy of the mother's life during pregnancy. This is definitely not to downplay rape and incest, but we want to talk about actual like facts and percentages and things like that. Do we have any data on reasons for the reasons people seek for abortion, or what tends to be the most pervasive reason for seeking abortion, and like maybe like a percentage of abortions that happen that would be from rape or incest or some of those other reasons I mentioned?
And we actually do have those statistics. Now, before I get to that, let me preface that Ingrid already talked about how we have really poor abortion reporting in the United States.
You said it was all elective, correct? Like voluntarily given.
Yeah, there are some states that don't even bother because it's voluntary to report the information to the CDC. Some of the best statistics actually comes from the abortion industry as well. But we have a colleague, Tessa Longbonds, who has done the deep dive. She's like a machine. She goes to each state and their data and pulls it out. And she's just last week put up the latest best information based on 8 states that were very complete in terms of their reporting. What she found was 95.7% were just what we might call the common reasons that had nothing to do with, the various exceptions that you were mentioning before, which means only a little over 4% had anything to do with these various exceptions you've talked about. Now, let's be clear, rape and incest are despicable crimes.
Yep.
And they need to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law.
Yep.
But there's again this sort of conundrum here. Why would you want to punish one of the innocent victims of that? Essentially, you're taking vengeance on yourself for the sins of the father to abort a child who started as a result of rape and incest. Ingrid gave you a great exposition in terms of the real issue about life of the mother, and essentially there is no instance where you have to intentionally destroy the life of the child. A small number of percent actually even listed that as a reason. Another unfortunate, heartbreaking when a child is diagnosed in the womb with some sort of prenatal abnormality, whether that's chromosomal or some other problem. Yeah. But again, we need to think about this perhaps in a different way, that we talk about these as exceptions. We're really talking about every life being exceptional. Every human being is a valued member of our species, a child of God. And one way to look at this is you're saying, well, because of the way you originated, or because you're not perfect in every way, we're going to discriminate against you. We're just going to end your life before birth. And that's really probably the best way to look at these types of situations. We don't condone any kind of discrimination after birth, but we are tending to allow some of these things to happen before birth.
Yeah.
And I think we really need to keep that in focus, that every one of these lives, no matter how they started, no matter normal, abnormal in terms of our particular perspective, is still a child of God who needs to be valued.
Yeah, absolutely. And to dig into this a little bit more, again, some of the misconceptions around this, is I think this has been most pervasive, is what did the Dobbs decision actually do concerning Roe v. Because I think there's been so much like misinformation, or just like, I'm not even sure what Roe v. Wade did in the first place, and I'm not even sure what the overturning did in the second place. So there's kind of uncertainty both ways about like, what does this actually do? Like, how does this actually affect abortion law, and how can we better, and I'll make this qualifier more lovingly, so not just slap somebody across the face and say, hey, get this right. Respond to our friends, family, neighbors who may either be on the fence around this and like, I'm not really sure what to think about this, who are actively opposed to the pro-life position. So what did it actually do, and how do we respond?
Yeah, and so one of the most pervasive misconceptions is that what Dobbs did was make abortion illegal. Well, that's completely wrong. Roe v. Wade had certain constraints, and it did, in a real sense, pretty much promote abortion across the land. It was wrongly decided almost 50 years ago based on wrong science and a wrong interpretation of the law. Actually, unelected justices actually making law in terms of their decision. In terms of all this, it really made the U.S. one of only 7 nations in the world that allows unfettered abortion up to birth. I mean, we're in company of places like the People's Republic of China and
good
North
company
Korea,
right there. Yeah.
Other, obviously human rights highlights, no, abusers.
Yeah.
Well, so you do away with Roe v. Wade. Essentially, some people might say, so that means we have no laws regulating abortion? Well, actually, you do. And what it did was give that right to decide to the people and back to the states and to elected representatives at the state and federal level. And that's why now you've got all this confusion about, well, this state versus that state and so on. But it really puts it back where the decision should be made, in the hands of the citizens of each and every state. It took almost 50 years to right that wrong. And in fact, if you look at the historical perspective, some of which is contained in the actual Dobbs decision, abortion was either completely or strongly prohibited prior to 1973 in Roe v. Wade. So you've gone back to, again, the people and their ability to decide for themselves. Now, so what do? Well, obviously, one of the first things we need to do as Christians is to speak the truth in love. We're kind of held to a higher standard. We can't lie about what this does and doesn't do and what abortion really means. So we need to educate people on these real facts, and we need to do it compassionately. Tara and Ingrid alluded to the idea about fetal pain. The idea that very early in the womb, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. We're developing to the point that at least by 15 weeks, and probably even much earlier, this little individual in the womb can experience pain and show signs of consciousness. The scientific studies really are incontrovertible at this point, that you have the nervous system developed. You have the parts of the brain that we now know actually do experience pain. These are developed. Tara Tara mentioned ultrasound. It's gotten a whole lot better. And in fact, there are ultrasound videos now of a little one in the womb who's about to have fetal surgery. Again, actually being therapeutic in terms of treatments of this second patient inside the womb. They're watching with ultrasound and they inject an anesthetic into the thigh of this little one. And what would your reaction be? Well, you see the same thing. You see this response. There are evidence again from ultrasound and studies where in twins, they're aware of the other twin and they're being very careful when they try and touch their face or other parts versus against the wall of the womb. They can distinguish just syllables like la versus lu by about 16 weeks. I mean, we're very clearly seeing this young individual develop and develop human characteristics, behavioral characteristics within the womb. So I think what we need to do is just very patiently and clearly talk about what the real facts are and also talk about alternatives to abortion. Most of the states that have these pro-life laws in place or are developing them have already started to put money towards alternatives to abortion. Texas, Ingrid's state, one of the best examples, they've allocated $100 million state dollars for alternatives, and that's to care for moms and their babies and their families and so on. There's a group of our colleagues that have put together a thing called Her Plan, HERplan.org, where they have cataloged a lot of these services that are available. Another one of our colleagues, Janine Maxon, has put out a fact sheet just within the last month about all of these state alternatives. So educate compassionately about what are the real facts and what are the alternatives.
Yeah, that's yeah, because you like it's implicit in your statement, but there's that narrative again that like if you're pro-life, be all the way pro-life and not just advocate for the birth of the child, but advocate for everything else after the child. It sounds like that's what's actually being done is people are like, yeah, we're actually trying to be all the way pro-life and not just at the moment of conception. And like there's like you said, there's things already in place and things developing that are in place that like they're actually trying to do this stuff too.
But again, most people haven't heard that, and it's incumbent on us to make sure they do, which is, again, thanks to you guys. We're really appreciative that you're getting this information out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's absolutely our pleasure for sure. But on a softer note too, as we kind of wrap this stuff up, as we conclude, how should we engage well with? So those we've talked about, like kind of combating bad arguments and building up the good science behind this stuff too. But for those women who've had abortions, so we haven't talked about that yet. How do we engage with? How do we care for those who've had abortions, and those who either have had them without remorse, as far as we can tell, or those who now question their decisions? How do we engage with those who've already performed this and come around them lovingly and talk to them about this stuff and maybe help them in the future? Like, hey, let's think about this. Let's pray about this. Let's talk about some of the science of it. Not to necessarily shame them and to say like, oh, you were terrible. Don't make this mistake ever again. This, which I think happens a lot of the time, where we kind of vilify this, which is like the performance of this should be vilified, but I think we tend to vilify the woman too, which to each their own. But it's how do we come around them lovingly and say like, hey, let's talk about this and let's move forward from this.
I would just start by saying that we are all sinners saved by grace, and so we all have made mistakes, right? None of us are worthy. That's why Christ had to come. We live in a broken world, and so I think that's the place to start. That if you're talking to somebody that is post-abortive, that to show them some grace, to listen, to show them compassion, and to lead them to Christ if she or he, because there's a lot of men that are post-abortive that are really need healing, and so I think there's also point them to resources. There are there are people out there that are post-abortive themselves and have started organizations to help others. I know of a couple, just Silent No More Awareness. You can go to www.silentnomoreawareness.org or Save One. I met them at a conference, just an amazing group of people that are there for both the father and the mother. So you can go to saveone.org /abortion recovery. I also think, pregnancy care centers are also there for women that especially tend to be more abortion minded. So especially if they've had 1 or 2 abortions, I think it kind of, Dr. Scott talked about this. A lot of times these pregnancies are wanted. It's just that their circumstances are such that they feel that they have no other option. So I think it's important that people understand that pregnancy health centers exist to help these women meet them where their needs are, to provide material needs, if that's what their need is. So I think that's another resource that I think that women need to be aware of.
Yeah. Is there anything before we conclude, anything else that you guys want to add to this that maybe we didn't cover, or kind of in your specialty that you wanted to highlight around abortion, whether misinformation or science or something else that you guys really want to kind of put an exclamation point at the end of this?
Well, but real quick before you guys jump in, if you want, I can tease something up if you if you're lost for thinking about something, but I'll let you go first unless you want me to go.
I'd just like to add on to what Tara said, that especially dealing with post-abortive women or the men associated there, a lot of times the toughest exterior hides the deepest and most painful wounds. And so I think, again, patience, compassion, and perseverance. Proverbs says that with patience, even a ruler may be persuaded, but a soft tongue will break a bone. So again, patient, compassionate, education, love them, try to keep steering them towards the resources that they need.
That's good.
And I'd like to address just the people that are pro-choice. My experience has been they also have women's best interest at heart, but they don't understand how damaging abortion is. So, again, the more we can get out there, this is such a suboptimal solution to crisis. And we've talked about many ways we can meet women in their crisis. At the time that Roe went into effect, the unmarried childbirth rate was 11%. And it was said at that time, we'll solve the problem of the unwanted child. And today it is 40% of women who are having children outside of wedlock.
Gosh.
In some minority populations, it's almost 70%.
I've heard that number, yeah.
And I think we've all seen the fatherless crisis that is happening in our country. So abortion didn't solve the problem of fatherlessness. It exacerbated it. Many reasons, I'm sure, for that. But the narrative, her body, her choice, has left men outside of the decision. And so this is gonna take a lot of work to reel this back in. I mean, passing laws is not going to solve this problem. It's going to slow some women down. But in the meantime, we need to make the argument to the American people, this was a bad experiment of 50 years. It didn't solve women's problems. It created more problems for women, for families, for society. And we need to do the hard work to address the upstream causes to really treat women in the way that they should be treated in their crisis, and hopefully to prevent many of these crises.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, it just gets even more clear for like a very out front pro-woman society, which is great. We're not actually that pro-woman, even though we say we are. We're actually very much the opposite, which is it doesn't get the airtime that it should.
Well, and also there's a lot of half the babies are women too. So what about those?
How pro woman, how pro life, how pro everything are we really actually if we're killing them?
And one last statement for me. Welcome feedback too, obviously. You can really judge a society based on how they treat the innocent. And who's more innocent than a baby in the womb? So I just feel like that is very impactful and people should think about. And, I'm careful about kicking around the word genocide, but I don't see how this isn't a genocide. But could you clarify if this is or isn't a genocidal issue?
Well, there are, I believe, 8 stages of genocide, and abortion fits every single one of the criteria. They've been dehumanized, they've been villainized. I mean, I can't recall them all, but they actually, it is the whole process of saying this is a life that is not valuable, that certainly not as valuable as the life of the woman. Is creating a genocide. And along those lines, most abortions, I think, are promoted by many progressive organizations for reasons of social engineering. There is a eugenic component when you look at who's having abortions. It is the poor minority population that are disproportionately affected. This motivation began in the 60s and it continues until today, even though, of course, it is painted in much more women-friendly euphemisms. But when you actually look at what's happening, you see beyond that.
If you knew the background of Margaret Sanger, you would be you would not like this stuff at all.
It's pretty bad.
Well, and I think I just want to add on to that too, like what Dr. Scott said about the eugenics. I mean, even if we just look at Down syndrome alone, I mean, we know that once a baby is even determined before birth to be at risk or to be, diagnosed with Down syndrome, we know that there is at least a 50% risk that baby is going to be aborted. And we're seeing that the Down syndrome population is going down in the United States. And we can see in other countries like Iceland, Denmark is on a similar path, that they have virtually eliminated the Down syndrome population because of prenatal of determining before birth whether the baby has Down syndrome and then aborting the baby once they do. So as Dr. Scott mentioned, all these reasons why people, have abortion, there is a definite eugenics component, especially when we start talking about the prenatal diagnosis. It's really a modern day form of eugenics.
Yeah, no, it sounds exactly, it's I think some people might think, well, like, that's a good thing that Down syndrome is going down, but it's the reason why it's going down is not a good thing whatsoever, is they're being killed before they have a chance to live. Well, David, Ingrid, and Tara, thank you so much for coming on, talking about a heavy issue, but talking about it with love, with grace, with facts, kind of combating some of the stuff that's been talked about out there. Hopefully we can push this out and get other people to interview you and push this narrative, because it's not just a narrative, it's a factual account of what's actually happening. But thank you so much thank you for the work of the Lozier Institute, for what you guys are doing, the articles you guys are producing, the video series, the laws that you guys are helping, and just everything you guys are doing is a humongous blessing for us. And we are privileged and blessed beyond measure to interview you guys and talk about this. And we hope others listen to this and share it with friends and family and say, hey, you might want to listen to this to actually learn what actually happens during this stuff. So thank you guys so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.